which focuses on films about human rights and is organized by people in need. Welcome to the debate about the movie White Noise. And we have an honorable guest, Daniel Lombroso, who is here with us. You can probably see him already, or you will see him in a moment. If you have any questions and want to ask them, you can do so via the Slido application or using the Facebook or YouTube comments. To present myself, my name is Jan Charvat. I work at the Faculty of Humanities of Charles University, and I look into political extremism, which is why I was chosen to moderate this debate.
Tohoto filmu. Tak a já využiju tu situaci, kterou mám k dispozici k tomu, abych položil na začátku
would like to ask some questions myself to begin with.
Moje první otázka je
my first question is as follows.
Čistě divácká.
It is a viewer's question from the point of view of a viewer. The film was shot in 2020, but it also looks into events that happened up to 2019. So, are you still in touch with the protagonists? Is there new development, new events?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. You know, the film more or less reflects where that movement is today. I think you see that even though that they've made inroads in the political discourse, their ideas have really gone from the fringes of American political life into the mainstream of American political life. You know, you're seeing these ideas on Fox News and the Republican Party in the mainstream of the conservative movement. In many ways, they've won by bringing those things mainstream. The individuals in the film have more or less become irrelevant over the past 2 years. So Lauren Southern, you know, who I think is in many ways the most complex and interesting in the film, she now lives in Australia with her, you know, her non-white partner, which you learn at the end of the film. She, you think maybe that she's moderating, maybe she's learning, but in fact she hasn't. She's doubled down on her extremism. She's now a COVID denier, an anti-masking advocate, and she frequently appears on TV in Australia as a conservative commentator. Mike Cernovich is doing much of the same as he was doing before, selling supplements and, you know, mixing in some conspiracy the way he always has. And Richard is more or less where he was when the film ends. He's living with his mother in Montana, you know, less relevant than he's ever been before. But I think it's important to say, like I said at the beginning, even though these three figures are falling off, their ideas are really now in the mainstream in America, which is quite a dangerous place to be.
Mm-hmm. Děkuju.
Thank you.
O mainstreamizaci krajní pravice
there are many people who speak about the mainstreamization of extremist thoughts, which is very well depicted in your movie, and it is also understood by the academia. For me, it was interesting to see the personal views and personal motivations of the protagonists. These were three important figures that influenced the American alt-right, but each of them has different motivations why he or she does what he or she does. Maybe you as a director, when you were looking at these people from a very close distance, because I understand that the movie was shot during 3 years, if I am not mistaken, so you got really close to them. Do you have some personal insights, something that you learned about their motivations? What do they actually believe in?
So the film is fundamentally about psychology. It's about human psychology. How does a person like Lauren Southern, a young, educated, you know, good-looking person who has her whole life ahead of her, how does someone like that become radicalized? How does Mike Cernovich, who's a practicing lawyer in California, how does someone like that become radicalized? And I think spending 3 years with these people all over the United States, I think 12 states, but also internationally to Russia, France, Belgium, you realize that extremism is a kind of drug. It makes you feel powerful. It makes you feel like life has a purpose, you know, that really transcends the day-to-day of, you know, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I spending my hours? It makes them feel like they have a duty or kind of a holy spiritual kind of purpose in their life. The problem is that it's a very dangerous one. You know, they're scapegoating other individuals. And most importantly, they're dedicating their life to preserving white dominance. What they want to do is see America stay a majority white. Obviously, that's changing very, very quickly. In 20 years from now, the United States will be a majority non-white. And if it was up to the three individuals in my film, they would stop that from happening. In the European context, I mean, Europe, you know, even though it is diversifying with migrants from North Africa, from the Middle East, they're worried that Europe is losing its white and Christian dominance. I think multiculturalism is a beautiful thing and we can learn from each other. The individuals in my film and this wider movement are dedicated fully to preserving white Christian dominance at any cost. I think it's important to say too, even though they're ideologues, they're also intoxicated by the fame, by the notoriety. We live in an age now with social media where you can say something racist or conspiratorial and get famous for it. You can make money off of it. And you see that, I think, most blatantly with Mike Cernovich, who built a brand by saying that Hillary Clinton had Parkinson's disease, which is obviously a lie. He became famous and then used his fame to sell supplements, to sell products, to buy his wife a new house, like you see at the end of the film. So it's important not to reduce it down. They are ideologues who are committed to preserving white power, but they also enjoy the fame and the notoriety that comes with this. And never before in history have we lived in a time where you could be a racist and also be a celebrity. But celebrity culture is now so deeply embedded in right-wing politics, and it's really hard to differentiate them.
Výborně, děkuju.
Thank you.
Já už tady mám první dotaz.
And I have already received some questions from our audience, but I still would like to ask a question myself.
Jsem položil předtím. Z vašeho pohledu je tam
From your point of view, is there a difference between the three protagonists, between their motivations and beliefs, or do you think they believe in the same things, or maybe draw on the same basics? Because I thought there were some differences. For example, with Mike Cernovich.
There are important differences, and I think the film is intended to give them space to explain their ideological beliefs. So Richard Spencer is clearly a 20th century fascist taking inspiration from, you know, Mussolini and the Nazis, very direct inspiration from 20th century fascism. Mike Cernovich is on the other side of the spectrum. He is a lifelong conservative, you know, believed in George Bush, but became disenfranchised with that kind of Republican Party. And he, you know, he might not believe in the mass exterminate. He does not believe, I should say, in the mass ethnic cleansing of minorities, of religious minorities, of Jews, but he does believe that the United States needs to preserve its white majority. He believes that immigration is a bad thing, that multiculturalism is a bad thing. And Lauren Southern is somewhere in the middle. She, you know, clearly believes in white superiority, and she says it openly in the film. But you know, she's much more worried about the European context, about preserving white power in Europe. And she says, okay, Canada's an immigrant society. Maybe Canada can diversify, but France has to stay French. And you see her obsessed with Islamophobia, obsessed with the so-called Muslim invasion of Europe. So, you know, the level of intensity, let's say, differs, with Cernovich being on the least end and Richard being on the most end, but that doesn't exonerate Cernovich, because Cernovich, in many far-right movements, you see that racism is intrinsically connected to so many other things. And with Cernovich, you see sexism, misogyny, conspiracy. He's mainstreaming so many other elements that are always at the core of fascist movements as well, believing in the domestic role of women, pushing misinformation. And Lauren Southern, I think, is very important as well, because even though she doesn't say what Richard is saying, she's the most skilled propagandist, almost like a Leni Riefenstahl. And she's able to wink and nod at what Richard is saying without saying it out loud. She's able to kind of say the quiet part out loud. So in a way, even though she's less extreme than Richard, I would argue that she's more effective than Richard at mainstreaming far-right ideology. So it is a spectrum, but all of them, you know, are kind of complicated and problematic in their own way. So it's not that Cernovich is better than Richard. He just is operating kind of in a different sphere.
Děkuju.
Thank you.
A já se teď podívám na ty dotazy, které přišly.
Now let's look at the questions from the
Díky za
audience.
film. Jak se vám
Thank you
podařilo
for the
dostat se
movie.
k protagonistům? Bylo
How did you
těžké získat i
approach
pro
the
natáčení?
protagonists and how did you make them agree to shoot the film?
It was a very difficult journey. So I'm a reporter. I was working at the Atlantic magazine at the time. I'm also Jewish, and I speak pretty openly when I meet them that I'm Jewish, and also that my grandmothers are Holocaust survivors. If you're coming from a far-right movement, I'm the exact kind of individual that they would malign, that they would despise. I think because I was so young and so sincere in really wanting to understand who they were, to understand their psychology, I had no agenda other than to understand and to show, the rest of my country how the conservative movement was changing. I wasn't coming in, with any sort of political perspective other than to really create a primary source document that, we can study, that historians can study in the years and decades to come. And, I would show up at these events and say, Lauren Southern, I know other people are coming and going, but I want to follow you for months, for years, and really see, the influence that you have for better or worse in the long term. And at first she was resistant, Cernovich was resistant, and Richard was resistant. But I think if you're a reporter, and many reporters, I'm sure in the Czech Republic know this, so much of the game is just showing up and doing it again and again and again. And with Richard, it took about a month or two. With Cernovich, it took 3 or 4 months of convincing him. And with Lauren Southern, it took 8 months of showing up and just, giving my pitch. And I think roughly 8 months into knowing her, she granted me permission and said, come to Russia. And that's a scene in the film. And from that point on, that trust was there. And I think it's just a lesson for anyone who does reporting or filmmaking or even research that when a subject says no to you, that's just the beginning of the story. And if you have that sincerity and you have that persistence, eventually they'll open up. So that's really all it was. And, for me being Jewish, the grandson of 2 Holocaust survivors, that was difficult for them too, but they came to make an exception for me over time. They would say, especially Richard and some people in Lauren's sphere, less so Mike Cernovich, would say, well, obviously, Jews and Jewish power is a problem, but we like you. You're the exception to the rule. And exceptions are something you see everywhere. Mike Cernovich says diversity is code word for white genocide, and yet he has a Persian wife and half Persian kids. Lauren Southern is fighting to protect white dominance, and yet you find out she ends up with a non-white partner. So, in many ways, they made an exception for me in the way that the subjects made an exception for their spouses and for other people in their lives.
Viděli tvůj film?
Okay, did they see the movie? Are they happy?
They're not happy with the film, and it's a shame because I think the film is fair to them. It tries to, like I said, be an observer of what's happening. It tries to depict a reality. It's a one-of-a-kind document of this unique moment in history. And I think they could have been adults and said, wow, I look like, the film shows them as hypocritical, as kind of lost, as narcissistic. And it could have been a chance for them to own up and say, I'm looking in a mirror, and for the first time I see myself and I see the errors in my ways. But instead, they turned to scapegoating. They personally attacked me. I dealt with a lot of anti-Semitic mail from people from the movement, not from the leaders, but from people in the movement, lots of it, which has continued into this year. And I like I said at the beginning, Lauren Southern is so young. Mike Cernovich is not a dumb guy. For them too, especially people who are, have some emotional intelligence, it could have been a chance, to own up and say sorry, especially for Lauren, someone who's so young. But unfortunately, they've just doubled down on their politics. And it looks good for them to beat the drum and say, look at this liberal reporter, he lied to me, and to attack me, to attack the media. It's very good for their brand, the brand that they're always building. And it's sadly a missed opportunity because this could have been a chance for them to finally own up and move past their really difficult and dark past.
Děkuju. Další otázka. Jaká je nálada v alt-right komunitě po zvolení Joe Bidena? Jak myslíte, že se tahle
sentiment of the alt-right scene now when Joe Biden was elected the US president?
It's tricky. I think the alt-right as we know it is more or less in retreat. I mean, the individuals, like I said, are at their mother's house or in Australia. They're kind of on the retreat, but you know, and Joe Biden's victory was difficult for them to swallow. All of them believed that Trump would win again. Many of them, as you saw, stormed the Capitol on January 6th. No one in my film, but many of the people who I've met over the years were at the Capitol siege on January 6th. And they were under the assumption that Trump, who they call the God Emperor, who they believe, you know, was going to preserve white dominance in America, they thought he was going to stay. They assumed whether it was through, you know, fudging the elections, blurring the lines, or through, you know, the Supreme Court, that they'd find a way to keep Trump in power. And I think it was shocking and a wake-up call for them to see, you know, the Democrats take over. And for someone like Joe Biden, who is not a left-wing radical, he's a moderate, he's you know, like a grandfatherly figure who is much less divisive than President Trump in many ways. It has taken the wind out of the movement. That being said, the Republican Party, which is the main opposition to Biden in the United States, has doubled down on Trumpism and this racially motivated kind of conservatism. So we don't see this stuff going anywhere. And in 4 years, when the US has another election, it's going to be Joe Biden or Kamala Harris versus maybe not Trump, but someone who looks like Trump, someone who speaks like Trump. In many ways, someone who speaks like the European far right. In Europe, they speak very openly about migration, about Islam, about changing neighborhoods. In America, we had a conservative tradition where they talked about taxes and international trade, things like that, you know, talked about the founding fathers. The conservative movement is not interested in tax policy anymore. They're interested in racialized politics and preserving, you know, a certain group's dominance in America. And even if the Biden administration is a very short pause to that, I think we're starting to look much more like Europe, where it's, you know, like Le Pen on the far right versus someone like Macron, who resembles Biden, who's a centrist, who's pro-multiculturalism. And that's the new paradigm, in my belief, in American politics.
Já jenom doplním
Yes.
ze svého pohledu,
Maybe
že vlastně
to complement
směřoval ten dotaz.
the alt-right movement.
Že jeho největší v podstatě vrchol byl zhruba okolo roku 2017. Od té doby
it is normally said that it peaked in 2017. So now there is less support, and this is also connected to the events in Charlottesville. Now, let's move on to the next question from our audience, which is slightly linked to what was said. What do you think about banning certain social media accounts, like was the case with Donald Trump? Do you think this is a good move? And we asked about Joe Biden versus alt-right, but what about the Republicans? What is the footprint Donald Trump left among the Republicans?
You know, social media is a very difficult question, and as a reporter, I'm cautious to say where the line should be drawn. It's a very you know, in the United States, we have a long tradition of the First Amendment. I know in Europe, there are hate speech laws. There are certain things you can't say. You can't deny the Holocaust, for instance, in certain countries, or you would get a ban. In the United States, even in Jewish neighborhoods, you can have neo-Nazis march through your neighborhood, and that's allowed. Even as a Jewish American, I think that's a good thing. I support the right for people to assemble. And I believe ultimately, when you have free discourse, the best ideas win out. That, you know, in this case, multiculturalism and liberalism will win out over fascism and ethno-nationalism. That's my personal belief. When it comes to social media, you know, it's a private company. It doesn't have to abide by the First Amendment. And there are very clear guidelines. There is no child pornography allowed on Twitter, for instance. Equally, there should not be incitements to violence. You should not be able to organize violence or, you know, call for violence on Twitter. And I'm very careful not to say ban this person or ban that person, but when someone is inciting a riot, is inciting violence, surely that's a call to be banned from a platform, because they can use it to mobilize so many people. We saw that on January 6th, when President Trump and his allies like Rudy Giuliani were calling for strength, to show strength. And, you know, many of their followers interpreted that as something, as to siege the Capitol building, which is the most important building in the United States after the White House. And, you know, when it comes to the question of does deplatforming work, I mean, it seems to work. President Trump was banned off Twitter, which I was mixed about, like for the reasons I mentioned, but it has been effective. I mean, he's been relegated to a secondary or tertiary conversation in the United States. You don't hear from President Trump. No one knows where he is anymore. He's probably in Florida at Mar-a-Lago. He doesn't have the ability to incite crowds and incite violence the way he did in the past. And a huge part of that is because he lost Twitter. Twitter was his most important tool in building his campaign and building the energy. So like I said, I'm mixed about where to draw the line, but it's pretty clear that when you do it for the right person, it is effective, like with President Trump. As for the Republicans, I think I spoke about this already, but what you see is that President Trump's footprint is all over the party. Just today, they voted to strip Liz Cheney, who is a lifelong Republican, Dick Cheney's daughter, of a lot of her responsibilities because she admits that President Trump lost the election. So many Republicans don't believe that he lost the election. They think it was stolen and therefore stripped her from her duties in Congress. That shows just a fundamental realignment where the Republican Party has become effectively a Trumpist cult, a cult that is dedicated, like I said, to preserving white demographics in the United States. And it will outlive Donald Trump. I mean, there are so many people who are jockeying to take over his base, whether it's Tucker Carlson, who's on Fox News, or Matt Gaetz, who's a young congressman in Florida, although he's now mired in a scandal. There are so many people who are thirsty, really seething to really out-jockey Trump and inherit his base. And I think we're going to be left with that kind of racially motivated politics in the United States for a long time.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I have two more questions from our audience. Often the directors establish close relationships with their protagonists, although they might not have the same view. What about you? Would you have a beer with the protagonists?
I spent thousands of hours with the three protagonists in the film across 12 states, 5 countries. You're seeing 90 minutes. I shot about 300 hours. And then you're thinking of all the time spent with them, eating dinner, traveling, being on planes, being in Ubers. They came to know everything about my life and I came to know everything about their life. And I think if you're a good reporter, you have to open yourself up to some extent. You have to show, that you're sincere and interested in them and that you're willing to tell them a little bit about yourself. That being said, there were very clear boundaries. I always made clear to them that I was a reporter, that I worked for The Atlantic, that this was a film that was not there to compliment them. It was to document them. It was to understand them. I never promised them any kind of coverage. I never said it would look this way or not that way. If they pushed me, I would say, I don't know what it's going to look like. And even, there were moments when they thought maybe I was their friend. They started to lean on me kind of like a therapist. And that makes some of the strongest some of the strongest moments in the film. You see Lauren Southern open up about sexual harassment, open up about her psychological trauma. She felt comfortable doing that because she felt comfortable with me. She came to believe that she wasn't speaking to 400,000 people who watched the film, but she was just speaking to Daniel. And I think that, if you're able to achieve that as a journalist, that's a very good place to be. You just have to be careful that you keep the boundaries. So when she would say afterwards, hey, do you want to come to this party? How about coming to my friend's wedding? Daniel, are you a friend? I would immediately shut it down and say, Lauren, I'm here in my capacity as a reporter. I'm here to understand you. I'm always willing to listen, but I'm not your friend. And that was something I had to do. And there were many moments when it got very uncomfortable. No one likes to have those conversations. But it's a necessary thing if you're going to keep your ethics as a journalist while doing, deeply embedded reporting. And it was complicated. It was very, very complicated.
Skvělý, děkuju. A poslední otázka, kterou to krásně uzavřeme od diváků. Jaké jsou vaše plány do budoucna?
What are your future plans? Are you working on another movie?
Je tohleto téma?
Or is this a topic that you want to develop in your future career?
I think this topic will be with me for life. Part of it being, the legacy of my grandparents, like I mentioned. And, I believe that multiculturalism will win out in the end, but the far right is not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere in Europe, and it's certainly not going anywhere in the United States. That being said, I would be happy to spend 10 or 20 years away from this topic. I hope to not have to revisit it for a long time. I want nothing more than for normalcy to return in the United States, for these Nazis to go back under their rocks where they, you know, belong to be, and for them to have less of an influence on our day-to-day lives. If that happens, and I'm somewhat confident it might, you know, I'll return to covering all different types of topics. Right now, I'm working on 2 stories. I work at the New Yorker magazine now, not at the Atlantic, which is, you know, a rival publication that's really big in the States. And I'm pursuing 2 stories. I can't say much about them, but one is about the border wall, but it's not as divisive as this. It's more about environmentalism and sustainability. And one is about New York. I'm from New York City. New York was ravaged by COVID, as I'm sure you all know. We had 800 people dying a day in last April. And the second story is kind of about the return of New York City. Finally, New York is returning. It's very exciting after, you know, a year of so much bloodshed in the States. So I'm really trying to focus on other topics, and those are both short films. And when I do make a next feature film, I'm hoping it's on something super low pressure. Maybe it's about dogs or plants or something, but definitely not racism.
Skvělý, my moc děkujeme.
Okay, thank you.
A to je všechno, díky moc.
So that's all, and thank you to